Me to talk about this work, which is really quite new, and it's going to end with a request to you for help. And this work is being done with Jennifer Merrilees, who you probably know is one of the long-term stalwarts of the nursing group here. Individuals with dementia and caregivers actually are on a shared journey. And today you're going to hear a lot about the patient's journey. That's been the focus of the work here for 20 years, and the changes that occur in cognitive and emotional and motor functioning, the effects that these have, where they come from, and ultimately how to treat them. That has been the heart of this. But on the other side of that journey, there's an important fact that we can't overlook, and that is that the caregivers are on a journey as well. And these are some very sobering statistics about the health of caregivers as they move through this period of life. In the realm of mental health, 2 to 4 times the rate of depression compared to non-caregiving people in their age group, 3 times the rate of anxiety disorders. In the realms of physical health, marked declines in physical health, greater healthcare utilization, declines in immune functioning. So we think about mostly the left side of this journey, but the right side is really important too. And now we have the Columbo mystery. Not every caregiver's journey is the same. This is 107 caregivers who came to our lab at Berkeley over the last 4 or 5 years as part of a research project that Jennifer and I have been leading. And these are their depression scores. And take a look at this spread. So 16 or higher is what clinicians consider to be actual full-blown clinical depression. About a quarter of the caregivers would be diagnosed as depressed. But look over here. 5% of the caregivers don't report any symptoms of depression. Many of them have just moderate levels. So this is the mystery. Why are some caregivers on this journey getting so sick and others are staying well? And of course, how can each of you end up on the left side of this chart? So that's what this research is about. There are 3 big questions. The first is, what happens to patients when caregivers get sick? And we know the answer to that. I'll tell you that in a second. The second 2 we're still working on. Why do some caregivers get sick and others do not? And how can we protect caregivers' health? So that's what we're up to. So first question, what happens to patients when caregivers get sick? We just finished a really large study of almost 200 patients and caregivers who were seen at the MAC and evaluated at Berkeley. We tracked them for 9 years after they were evaluated at Berkeley, and we did a kind of a fancy statistical analysis that enabled us to sort of say, what's the relationship between how long patients live and how depressed their caregivers get? And the answer was quite clear. If you are a patient whose caregiver gets depressed, you're about 50% more likely to have died during this period. It's about a 1-year shortening of life that occurs when caregivers get sick. Now we know that some of that is because as the patient gets worse and worse, the caregiver gets more and more depressed. But we're also able to show that some of it goes in the other direction. So caregivers who are not well are not going to be making as good health decisions for the patients in their care. They're not going to be able to muster the energy and the focus to keep appointments and to monitor as closely. So this is a very significant finding, we think, and it suggests that when caregivers get sick, not only do they suffer, but the patients in their care are at greater risk as well. Now the second question is, why do some caregivers get sick while others do not? Most of the literature before we started looking at this focused on what we call external stressors. And these are things like, how much insurance do you have? How easy is it for you to get transportation? What kind of help do you get from your family? What we decided to focus on are these more psychological pathways. What kinds of changes in the patient are associated with increases in illness in caregivers? What are the qualities that caregivers have that protect them against getting sick? And then what's turning out to be really interesting and important is what do we see in the relationship, in the changing relationship between the patient and the caregiver that helps us predict who's going to get sick? And we call these things behavioral molecules, sort of like proteins, but they're in behavior, and they're involved in this process of getting sick. Now, some of you have been to our lab at Berkeley, and if you have, you know that we bring people in and we do lots of things to them. They look at movies, and they interact with their partners, and we measure different physiological responses, and this gives us a very exact assay of emotional functioning in the patient, in the caregiver, and in the caregiver and patient relationship. We've studied 600 patients over the last 20 years in this way at Berkeley, and about 200 patient and familial caregiver dyads. So we're starting to get one of these big databases that enable us. How many of you have been over to Berkeley? Great. Thank you. It's paying off, and I'm going to make a pitch in the end for the rest of you to come by. I'm going to talk today quickly about two behavioral molecules that give us sort of hints as to this mystery as to why some caregivers get sick and others don't. The first is, this is very small stuff we're measuring. This is a study of something that's people watch an unpleasant film and they look away. It's just the way we're wired up. Everybody does that. We've discovered that in some of our patient groups, that starts to disappear. That little thing changes. Patients stop looking away. When patients stop looking away, caregivers start getting depressed and sick. We think this is a gateway that is sort of an early indicator that the patient is going to start developing emotional problems that are going to be very, very challenging for caregivers. And this is something we can quantify and measure at the bedside. So we're quite excited about this. Now, here's something new that we're working on. This is looking at the interactions between patients and caregivers when they're talking in our lab about a problem that they're facing together. And what we do is we let them talk for 10 minutes, and then we look at moments of positive emotion. And the patient is in black, and the caregiver is in gray. And so here's a moment where let's say maybe the caregiver smiled, and then it's followed by a moment where the patient laughs. It turns out that the extent that caregivers respond to positive emotion on the part of patients with positive emotion, the more they do that, the healthier the caregiver stays. So this little thing of not ignoring positive emotion, there may not be a lot of it. We don't know yet whether it's cause or effect, but it's the kind of thing that we can start evaluating as a possible thing that we might be able to train people to work on. We certainly know it's a sign, a good sign for caregivers when this positive emotion is batted back and forth. Interestingly, negative emotion doesn't matter. So it's not the anger and the fear that we would normally focus on, but it's the affection and the enthusiasm and the kindness that is really important in keeping in caregiver health. Okay, so real world implications, and I'll finish up. For question 2, why do some caregivers get sick while others do not? We think we can eventually develop a kind of a risk index that's based on these molecules that will enable us to make predictions as to which caregivers are at particular risk for adverse health consequences. And if we can identify that, we can then work with those caregivers to try to help protect them. So that's a big goal of this work. The second is, how do we protect caregivers' health? We need to develop and evaluate new interventions for caregivers. They're not going to be drugs. The interventions that have been tried so far have not worked well. I was at a meeting at the National Institute of Aging where they said that the first 200 interventions that had been tested had failed in community trials. So we are now engaged in a new project. We are just about to get grant funding with it between Berkeley and UCSF and a tech company in Silicon Valley called People Power, where we're going to try to develop a caregiver-friendly home. We're going to try to develop technology and put it in the home that will help caregivers deal with some of the challenges of caregiving. And so I end my talk by asking for your help. We hope that you'll want to come to Berkeley and help us discover new behavioral molecules. I have some folders that describe what we do. And if we get this grant funding, we would like to talk to some of you about your experience of caregiving, get a better sense of what are some of the things that we could do that would be workable in your homes. And if you have the time and the energy, we actually are going to have a stipend that goes with this, but we're going to start setting up focus groups with Jennifer to talk to you and get your advice as we design this caregiver-friendly home. So thank you very much.